So I know the campus, and I am pleased to come back to this beautiful place. So thanks for supporting the Center for Civil Society. I think they're doing great work here in India to try to help shape public policy to make India a more prosperous and free country. And for you to take time out of your busy days to hear me speak. My email ID is there if you want to jot it down, or somehow you can, maybe the organizers will give it to you. If you have further questions or want to continue this conversation afterwards. As he indicated, I sort of took the title from Piketty's book and played around with it to construct the title as I present it here. I've given a similar presentation where instead I put an inquiry into the nature and causes of the inequality among nations, which dealt with this problem much in the same manner, but I chose Adam Smith's book as a crib for the title. So this is what now it's gone off. It was working just a moment ago. Can someone? There we go. All right. So what we have here, and one has to be envious, especially if you're an academic, to be able to get the kind of book sales that Thomas Piketty has for this book, which was what I would call a sort of neo or a post-Marxian critique of capitalism. Many of the arguments that he presents are somewhat familiar if you know something of the corpus of work of Marxist philosophy and economics. Of course, and I had seen somewhere that it was one of the best-selling books that nobody ever read. But in fact, a lot of best-selling books people don't read. They're good to have on the shelf. You read the foreword, the introduction, maybe the conclusions, or a bunch of reviews. But in any case, you would love to have these sales, I mean, if you're a writer. Now, his basic observation was that income and wealth inequality is worsening over time and across countries based on rates of return on capital. So this is his kind of headline observation, that the return on capital is exceeding the rate of growth. And he sees that this is the basis of the problem of inequality. So much like Marx said that private property is the problem. For Marx, the private ownership of capital was the problem. Now, for most economists, the problem is scarcity. And this problem of scarcity creates a set of human responses that lead to this thing that we call private property, because private property is the basis for us to engage in voluntary trade. It gives us a good way of escaping this Hobbesian nightmare of depending on violence as a way of solving conflicts. So Piketty says the accumulation of capital is the problem in his view. Now, so he then turns to some policy proposals to remedy this inequality that he observes. And he says that, and we often hear this. I mean, the United States government used this expression, we have to destroy the village to save the village in Vietnam when we were there. And so John Maynard Keynes was all about saving capitalism from itself, and now Thomas Piketty has taken on this mantle to save capitalism and preserve democracy. Because one of the subtexts of this is that these inequalities are not only, in his view, unreasonable, but that people in general will see them as unjust. That means that they'll be untenable, and this would lead to a threat of revolutionary change or social upheaval as a consequence and a response to that. And of course, the interesting thing is, this is just a claim. All of these are just claims, because we know historically that there are instances where there's wide disparities of income or wealth that don't invite or encourage revolution. My understanding is all revolutions were based upon imbalances of political power. You threw out the British because you didn't want people lording it over you that had privileges and power over your life. It wasn't because they were richer than you were. So we start with some problematic assertions and some background sort of thinking on this. And this is what goes on today in the public discourse. There's just this assumption that the current types of inequalities that are widening, as they seem to be, will cause social or political instability and perhaps threats to the established economic order. I'm not convinced of that, and that's what I'm going to discuss. Now, so we could have taken Jonathan Swift's approach to this. How did Jonathan Swift see that we should deal with inequality? Has anybody read Swift? Well, he thought the poor Irish should sell their children as food for the rich. That would be a response. Well, most of us wouldn't go along with that. But I would suggest to you that what I'm going to interpret as many of Piketty's proposals are not much less harebrained, that they're quite problematic. So I'm going to ask you to think about this. Well, of course, many of you already have your answer, but I don't see that inequality is an economic problem. Economic inequality or wealth inequality is not an economic problem. It's a political issue. It's an item of political discussion. But it is not, and again, I don't see the historical evidence that reveals to us that this creates an economic problem that will undermine economic prosperity and progress. And does it cause a social and political upheaval? Again, historically, I don't see it. And Piketty doesn't give us any theory on it. Piketty just makes an assertion that it is dangerous. So now let's look at I'm not sure what's wrong with this thing. Doesn't like to work. There we go. Now, so Piketty then, like most politicians, I mean, if you think about it, every action by legislators, by people in political power, is to act towards some type of redistribution. Virtually every piece of legislation, whether it's giving a subsidy, giving some sort of privilege, assigning taxes, is about redistributing income or wealth. So this is something dear to the heart of every elected politician. They like it when people tell them that that's a good idea. Now, as a citizen, and especially as a taxpayer, you may not think that's quite as much fun, because it's as though people are coming into your house and saying, look, what you have is not available to you. We've decided that someone else should have more of it, and you're not entitled. So what's happened over time, democracy has been corrupted such that governments have the first claim over what we have. Your wife doesn't have it. Your children don't have it. Your husband doesn't have it. You don't have it. The state has the first claim. You must give what... Now, the state was developed broadly as an instrument to promote human liberty and personal dignity. The state, if we go back to the ancient philosophers, there was nothing in the commentary that suggests that the state should be involved in the sorts of things that involve the kinds of redistributions that we see today. The primary role of the state was to secure life, liberty, and property. Now this is the articulation that eventually evolved in the hands of people like John Locke. But this is the logical development. So the state was not invented neither to produce goods and services, nor to be a redistributive game. And that's what it's about. Politics as we experience it today is about who will wield and possess political power, not who will advance human progress. So we've got this corrupted outcome that was never meant to be that way. Now, Piketty is then he's conceding this, that the state has first claim. It's whatever they decide, whoever they is your obligation. Now, again, and I'm following Locke here, and you may find problems with that, but all I want from the only obligations that I have to the general public is to act peacefully towards other people. That doesn't require me giving up my income or wealth. To keep my promises, fulfill my contracts, to not defraud people, and not to harm them. Now, and if I don't fulfill those obligations, then we generally concede that force should be used against me in some manner. But this isn't the way it works now. The state has a legal monopoly on violence and force that they can exercise against you if you refuse to cooperate with whatever it is they think should be done. But who is they? Well, it's not us. Democracy doesn't work in the idealized manner where well-informed citizens make well-informed choices and that the leadership is our servant. VIP convoys reveal who is the servant and who is the master. State officials acquire privileges that are not accessible or available to citizens. This is a violation of the rule of law, which is one of the fundamental concepts that govern what we call democracy. The rule of law is that everyone must be treated equally before the law, and that government officials in particular should not be granted privileges that are not available to citizens. But we do it all the time. Now, deference is a different issue. You can be deferential to them. You can hang garlands on them or touch their feet however you like. But they should not be granted a privilege that you, a citizen, is not entitled to. So, I'm reluctant when I encounter these sorts of demands that we're going to resolve inequalities through the force of the state. Unless we understand better how these inequalities evolved. And I think Piketty, for all of his wisdom and deep learning, has missed a number of important points. And my dear friend Sergit has addressed some of these so that you might go to him for more in-depth critiques that I won't be able to make here today. But the idea supposedly, and this is a sort of an old fallacy, that the same amount of money will impact different people differently. So if I'm a billionaire and I give up $1 million, that could be trivial to me given the amount of resources I have at my disposal, whereas 100 rupees to a poor man might be devastating. Again, the attempts to make these arguments will often lead us to some problematic solutions. If we decide that we're going to use the instruments of political power and by implicit cause give in to the threat of force and violence, I already see that morality is off the books. Moral acts can only be exercised by human beings. Governments, as Gandhi pointed out, is a soulless machine. It doesn't exercise on the basis of morality. It exercises on the basis of power. Now, of course, we all are told that public officials are morally superior, that their acts are based upon higher moral standards. But there is no objective measure that certifies that. The only way we know that an action is moral or not is if it's based upon voluntary choice. And that is in the hands of an individual. So if the state obliges you to give up some of your resources to give to someone else, they engage in an immoral act of force, and there's no moral content in the result. They're giving up somebody else's money. There's no moral act in that. A moral act is I give up what I choose to give up, what I grant to you, how I value you. But to pretend that the state using force is doing so on the basis of morality, or that the process itself is moral, is fallacious. Now, so what happens is that Piketty says, okay, I want to use the instruments of democracy. The instruments of democracy would be regulation, taxation, redistribution, as a way of curbing income inequality, reducing it. But using instruments of democracy sounds very lovely. But if you think of democracy as nothing more than the exercise of political power, you step back a bit more and say, whoops, who has that power? What are its limits? Where does it stop? Now again, these are merely gestures. When you say, I am acting in the name of the poor, I am acting in the name of the needy. Those are that's in a way should be one of the most frightening statements that you hear a politician utter. Because the next step is they're coming for your pocketbook. They're coming for your freedom. Because governments can give nothing that they don't take from you. And that includes, they can't acquire power without taking your freedom. They can't acquire resources without taking it from us. So, we need to be very cautious about embracing or trying to require more, it's working, yeah. Granting more political power. Majorities are momentary. And the legislation that comes out of the demands of that majority is often based on wild passion, like in the United States after 9/11. People demanded that the state take more power to be able to eavesdrop and to invade privacy because of this sort of momentary hysteria and fear and desire for security. But in doing so, most people regret it. People that think about it. This was a bad step. But this is what happens. So, in a way, I think we're at the same sort of risk here. That if we buy into Piketty's argument, we may grant political power that we will, in fact, regret. So, for example, he thinks that anyone that makes over $500,000 should have an 80% marginal tax. So, if you earn anything over that, you keep 20%. And the state has first claim over what you earn. Well, most of us don't earn $500,000, so we say, well, that doesn't sound so bad because it's not going to affect me. But I challenge this on the basis of the questions of morality and a theory of justice that supports this argumentation. The other thing that he prescribed was an internationally enforced progressive wealth tax on any kind of network. And again, most of us don't earn more than one. Anyway, why wasn't it $600,000? Why not $450,000? Why not? Well, of course, you start with something. You're an academic. You just throw something out there. I suppose Piketty makes less than, at least when he wrote this, he earned less than $500,000. If he'd earned $500,000, he probably would have said $6. But this is what our instincts are. But this is all very arbitrary. Where do we get the idea that when is it too much? And why? But why is it too much? Now, if someone's income or wealth is based upon depriving you or dispossessing you, That's unjust. But as far as I understand, all of these wealthy individuals gain that wealth primarily through satisfying market demands. In other words, human desires. If you don't like these outcomes in the sense that Piketty doesn't, then you don't like human beings being able to exercise their own judgment as to what's best for them. Now, some of these people, now if your wealth is based upon the grant of a state monopoly, that's an easy solution. State monopolies should not be allowed. States should not be able to grant monopolies. Now that's an injustice because that's a privilege that's not available to everyone else. That violates the rule of law. But me earning, she comes up with an app at the end of this conversation, goes online and sells it to 5 million people for $1. What's unjust about that? Why should we take that away from her? Why should we tell those people, in a way you're saying, people that paid for that, your judgment was wrong because you gave us inequality. It was your act that caused that inequality. And this is where Piketty goes wrong here. Like a lot of us professors, we're stuck with what we learned and what we know, and we don't react and adapt to the world when it changes. So it turns out that many of these very large incomes come from a different form of capital than what is in the back of Piketty's mind, I suppose, and certainly what was on Marx's mind. So Marx was thinking about tangible, objective physical capital, factories, land, and so on. But most of the wealth that's created in this apparently very widely skewed and unequal manner is based on intangible capital, that app, software. And this can be scaled in a manner that physical capital never could be. So we're not really understanding that something new has happened. We're simply reacting based on this old knowledge and maybe this perhaps bias against capitalists. But she's not a capitalist. She's just a student that came up with a good app. Why should we punish her for the judgments that you made? And this is what I think is behind Piketty's reasoning. He's wrong about the nature of capital. Most of the high incomes and accumulation of wealth is based upon intangible capital in a way that's never been before in the history of the world. The opportunities, now, which also means if she makes this app, other people could imitate it, but there will be fewer opportunities that aren't unlimited. Well, there may be unlimited. We don't even know yet. The billionaires today will not be the same people in 10 years because something different will occur. And that will allow them to billionaires. So, what's going on with this thing? It doesn't like to cooperate. Okay, now, one of the other things that I have a problem with is that although global incomes are rising and there is this greater disparity in income and wealth, the reaction to this has been several. We see that Pope Francis, inequality is the root of social ills. That's a very strong statement. That is, it's the most important source of social ills. Barack Obama said it's the defining challenge of our time. Now, I understand Obama because he's a politician. Politicians love to be given the right to redistribute what we produce. It has very little consequence to them. It falls on us. It comes out of our family's well-being. It comes out of our pocket. Pope Francis, well, he's a great guy, a nice man. He's done wonderful things for the poor. But what is he doing? And like Oxfam, what? Like Oxfam recently released a report that 1% of the people gain 82% of the wealth created over the last year, and the poorest half of humanity got nothing. Got nothing? Well, this was a headline. It would invite certain introspection here because got nothing is kind of a strong statement. But my point here is, what are they doing banging on about inequality? The biggest social problem is poverty. Inequality is not the economic problem. Poverty is. And if you look at the mission statement of Oxfam, the power of the people against poverty, but they're going on about the rich. They're not telling us how the poor can be lifted up, except by making other people worse off. And why is the Pope engaged with that? Why is he concerned about the spiritual condition of the poor instead of how much money Warren Buffett has in his bank account? The real problem that we should be concerned with if we are truly... Now, if you think that inequality is a big problem, then you must feel sorry for me. I'm deeply impoverished compared to Jack Ma or Bill Gates. They have a vastly greater amount. No, don't worry about me. Worry about the dispossessed, the poor, the impoverished. Now, so what we need to worry about is absolute poverty, not relative poverty. And the reality of the world as we see it is more complex than there was a famous song in the 1930s. It was a very sort of, nice tune. It was, the rich get rich and the poor get poorer. In the meantime, anyway, it goes like that. So the rich get rich and the poor get poorer. Well, there's two things wrong with that. One of them's, and as though Piketty may have this same false sense, that the rich are getting rich by making the poor poorer. But that's not the way markets work. Markets work based upon me providing you something with you value more than what you give up. So market exchange is a positive-sum game. And politics is always a zero-sum game. If I give him a subsidy, I give him a tax obligation. He wins, he loses. But if I trade with you, you give me something you value more, less for what I give you that you value more, and the reverse. We both win. Now, so the thing is, poetry needs to be terse. But the song would have gone better if it said, the rich are getting richer at a more rapid rate than the poor are becoming less poor. It's hard to make that rhyme. But unfortunately, we're all vulnerable to slogans because they catch on. This inequality that we're seeing today, much of it is based upon changing economic conditions that have nothing to do with injustice, have nothing to do with violations of people's human dignity. It doesn't make me less of a human that Jack Ma adds $1 billion to his bank account. It doesn't weaken me as a bearer of rights in a just social order. I don't see the big problem with inequality even in these excesses. Because unless you believe that the rich can only get rich, unless you have this archaic idea that trade is a zero-sum game. This is what drove mercantilism. This was the logic of colonialism. This is what Adam Smith criticized and revealed clearly, that the wealth of nations was based upon the capacity of the country to engage in trade. So, this was an argument, and Smith was very vocal against colonialism. Colonialism was an abomination. He saw it as something that was costly and holding back the British Empire. So, what we see is that this seeing capital and capital accumulation, which presumably is private, which is Piketty's complaint, is in fact based upon some presumptions that I've discussed that are simply on weak ground. So, is inequality really so bad? And if it is the fault capitalism? Because Piketty said it was. Capital accumulation is the problem. He didn't see the role of the state. Now, let me give you another explanation for widening wealth. Please come in. They're waiting to. Now, one of the other important reasons why we see wide inequalities of income and wealth is central bank policy. You all know something about the property market in India. You all know something about the share market in India. Now, what's happened is that by contrivance and by executing central bank policy, artificially low interest rates, the central bank has created massive amounts of liquidity, which are then used by the rich to be leveraged so that they can become super rich. The super rich were able to leverage that liquidity provided through central bank policy to become mega rich. Well, that wasn't capitalism in the sense that the fundamental source was central bank policy, which is under the control of the state, not under the control of the market. So, a lot of this wide disparity in income and wealth can be explained very clearly. It's the same in the United States, same around the world. A lot of the income inequality can be explained either by intangible capital being able to be scaled in a manner which it never could be before, and the other is central bank policy. So even the inequality that we're so distressed about, or supposed to be so distressed about, has very logical argument behind it. If you want to diminish that, start with central bank policy. Or I would have said, don't let the central banks do it in the first place, but they did. And what do we do about the clever young student that produces apps and instantaneously becomes a millionaire? Should we thwart that? Should we hold them back? What's the theory of justice for that? What's the idea of morality behind that? Where do we get the idea that we need to expand political power to suppress the innovative impulses of the young? And what theory of justice decides that granting the state more political power as an instrument against human liberty and personal dignity is justified? I find it very problematic. So, now, economists had a lot to talk about in free market capitalism and inequality. Of course, Marx had his views. We mentioned that before. Private capital accumulation inevitably leads to concentrated wealth in fewer hands. Now, again, Marx was no dummy. If Marx was revived today, he would look back and say, you know, I'm not sure he would buy into Piketty because he was a lot smarter than most of us. His idea was that private ownership of capital was the cause of the misery of the working class, and that misery would eventually lead to an uprising through class warfare and so on. And so therefore the solution was to take away private property. But in fact, Marx would look around today and say, hang on, the working class conditions are infinitely better than I expected them to be. Not only are they better from year to year, but compared to when he was writing about it and observing it. So he would have to say, well, I'm not going to torture reality to fit my theory. I'm going to examine my theory to see how I can come closer to understanding reality. Simon Kuznets was another economist, and he saw that the forces of growth would have this balancing effect, where capitalism and technology in the later stages of development would, and in a way this explains this historical development, where workers were able to capture a great deal of the returns from technological improvements that allowed them to be more productive, and they were rewarded accordingly. So Kuznets was quite an optimist about this. And then there are non-economists like Piketty, who suggests there's no natural spontaneous process to prevent permanent, and again, destabilizing inequalities. Destabilizing is an assertion. There's no theory in Piketty, and I'm not a political scientist, but I've read quite a lot. I don't know in political science of a theory that predicts it, or historian that writes that revolutions are driven by income inequalities. At least, and maybe it's just my naive interpretation, it's about imbalances of political power rather than imbalances of economic positions. Because if we look at the reality of, say, pre-reform India, where the babus, the public officials, were much better off than most of the poor in India. The income disparities, given that those people could travel the world, the people at the top, whereas the Indians at the bottom couldn't travel from village to village. That's a very much wider income disparity in real terms of what you can accomplish. But there was no revolution against that. Now, many of the poor in India have mobile telephony, and they have much greater mobility. Even though now the disparities may be even greater, but the real disparities are less because they have much more control over their lives and the ability to satisfy themselves. John Rawls came up with this idea of a difference principle, a philosopher, not an economist, where inequalities are justified if they serve the least fortunate. Now, so in other words, if the poor become poorer at a slower rate than the rich become richer, I don't see why that is an economic problem. As long as the poor... Now, why are people poor? And this is what the discussion should be about, not who has so much money. Well, here's my interpretation. People are poor because they don't have jobs. I'm very simple. Now, if you give them land, you've got to give them seed, fertilizer, capital, and so on. So giving peasants land, wherever we are, is not going to solve the problem of poverty. They tried that in Zimbabwe. They broke up all the large farms, divided the land among the yeoman farmers, and the country went to becoming a food importer rather than a food exporter as they had been. Education by itself doesn't guarantee success. Education is neither necessary nor sufficient for economic success of individuals or countries. People are poor because they don't have jobs. Why do they not have jobs? Well, not enough new businesses being created to absorb them. Why are there not enough new businesses being created? Well, the World Bank has something called the Doing Business Report, and they rank countries according to how easy or difficult or expensive or timely is it to open a business. And what you'll find in that Doing Business Report is those countries where they rank lowest have the most poverty. In other words, they're creating the fewest jobs, creating the fewest opportunities for women to escape the conservative, stifling conditions of their homes and to be able to make more choices about their destiny in life. People are poor because they don't have jobs. They don't have jobs because there's not enough new businesses. And there are not enough new businesses because governments are not in the business of making it easier for you to open a business. They're in the business to make it harder for you. Because if they make it easier for you, you don't need them. Now, every time a babu is in between you and what you want to accomplish in life, there's an opportunity for corruption. They don't want to give up that power. They don't want to give up that possibility. So, what we find is that people are poor because governments choose policies that keep them poor. I use the example of Cuba. Cuba has one of the highest literacy rates in Latin America. There are no jobs. Well-educated graduate women become hookers because they can't get work. And it's because the state has denied private property, has interfered with market exchange, and therefore there are not enough jobs for especially women to have better options than to be a prostitute. This is criminal. This is unjust. This is inhumane. And we're worried about how much money Jack Ma has? Where's your humanity? Jack Ma is not making people poor. Jack Ma is making people's lives better, and they reward him for it. Now, if Jack Ma was becoming rich because the Chinese government gave him a monopoly over web-based sales, then I would say that's unjust. But that would be because there was force behind what he did. The state enforced the monopoly to his privilege against the rest of the people. So, let's look at this. Income inequality is the outcome of voluntary human actions for the most part, unless the state is involved in granting monopolies and privileges to one group or another. It turns out that income inequalities themselves, it's something that most economists realize, is that income inequalities of some sort, now we're not talking about, but just as a general concept, income inequalities are an inspiration for other people to see the possibility of advancement themselves. The goal should never be equal income. And I don't think that the role of the state should ever be to promote redistribution of income and wealth based upon force, implicit threat of violence, based upon a momentary majority, based upon an ideology that's fleeting, based upon the passions of the moment. Because the only permanent power in our lives is political power. There's no economic power. A company can have economic dominance, like Nokia, until it doesn't. Like BlackBerry, until it doesn't. These were dominant economic players. As long as, and what the state should do is make certain that there are no imposed restrictions on competition so that people can innovate, replace, and satisfy consumers. Now, okay, let's move on to the next point. Now, it turns out, and Piketty tried to create this idea that there's a much greater permanence of wealth now than there has been in the past. But I read, I won't be able to cite this thoroughly enough for you, but I read a report where they went and examined the families that had wealth in Florence. And it turns out that sort of like 8 out of 10 of the same families that were super rich under the Medicis are still the same people. Let Now, of course, what happens is that the family, though, not the individuals, because the family, a lot of that wealth gets diluted when you start spreading it out among inheritors. But in a country like Italy, where over those centuries, there was a lot less social mobility. The more social mobility there is, the less likely people will be trapped in poverty and oppression. And the more economic opportunity there is, the more likely they'll be able to escape their historical conditions that might involve injustices. So, capital owned by business firms could be like mines, farms, factories, all that sort of thing. But now what we see is that they pay wages so that workers can buy things. Henry Ford decided to raise the wages of his workers because he wanted his workers to be able to buy the products that they produced. This was a spontaneous act on his part. He thought, I think he didn't get it in a way. I mean, it was a nice gesture, but of course, he depended on many more people than his workers to buy his cars. So that by itself was not a significant act, but it was an interesting act in itself. What about the inequalities caused by government actions? Now, for example, in the United States, public sector employees earn over 40% more than the average taxpayer. Is that just? I don't know. Is that fair? That the people who are working for the citizens earn more than the citizens on average. They have a better pension program that is not available to the general public. That's a privilege. That's unjust, in my view. It violates the rule of law. They're given a privilege that I don't have. And they can go back into the private sector and work and then receive from the public pension fund that they never contributed to before and receive two different pensions. I would say that's unjust. I don't know about you. I think it's unfair. It's a privilege that's not available to me as another citizen. So what do we do with these things? So a lot of inequalities have nothing to do with the market. And these inequalities come from privilege. Those kind of inequalities are unjust and should be addressed first. So, state-controlled access to markets or interventions for the politically connected. And we know if we look back at, the Tata and Reliance and Hindustan Motors and all these industrial groups that had privilege that was taken away and was available at the cost to the consumer. And this is one of the problems with central planning and socialist policies. The least important entity in a plan is the consumer, the human, you. They don't count for that. So what if you have to pay more for an ambassador than you would have to pay for an imported Suzuki at the time, if they would allow them in? We're going to support this policy, and we're not going to change it because you, the consumer, is dissatisfied with it. Where's the humanity in that? Tell me. I, as a government official or as a diplomat, can import to India when I return from my mission overseas, duty-free, and other citizens can't. Where's the justice in that? Where's the humanity in that? Why do they get this privilege that you, a citizen, don't have? So, again, I think if Piketty would think more clearly about the nature of capital, which I don't think he fundamentally understands, although he's meant to, He has a different understanding of capital than me, which I think is wrong. And he has a different understanding of the nature of how the change in what we see as capital today has transformed the opportunities for the rich to become super rich. And then, he takes an outdated idea and says, well, capital is a problem. If we somehow diminish the amount of capital that capitalists hold, the world will be a more just place. But my argument is that using political force and violence is not an act of morality or justice. It is simply a presumption that what you're doing is better for the community. I'm getting a bit warm, so I'm going to start shedding things here. So Piketty came up with what he called the iron law of capitalism, whereby the return on capital would remain above the economic growth rate. And, I may fall apart here, all these things. Sorry. I like to be mobile. I don't like to sit, so requiring all these trappings here. Okay, now, so we have this issue that to me is not a problem. Inequality is a reality, but it's not an economic problem, and it's a political issue rather than the source of political instability. It's a political issue because you can win votes. Because what is redistribution about? I develop a vote bank by promising you to give what he has. This is the nature of democratic political processes. It's a redistributive game. Democracy was meant to be an instrument to promote human liberty, to promote human flourishing, not to produce public education, not to produce public health care, not to even to produce roads, because if you look at the original constitutions, the role of the state was limited to protecting life, yours, liberty, your ability to exercise your will rather than them exercising their will over you, and property, the things that you produce with your hands or your mind. That was what the original intent of democracy was. It wasn't an instrument. It wasn't meant to be a distributive game. The people who thought deeply about democracy did not imagine professional politicians. The idea of democracy was that you would have the citizen stand up at a needed time and then retreat back to the private sector. But in fact, what we see around the world is that politicians have become a professional class that grant themselves privileges, whether it be better pensions or chauffeur-driven cars or occupying the most valuable real estate in any country and keeping it from the citizens where it could be used more productively, especially now than when most government activities can be carried out online. Shift them out of the central business district. Why are they there? Maybe, the British put them there because they wanted to be protected from you. It was easier if they were concentrated in a place where they could get their soldiers in. But you don't need that now. So we should shift them out. Now, wealth divide has grown since the mid-1970s. And Piketty must really, there's lots of good reasons to hate Donald Trump. But Piketty probably hates Donald Trump even more because he reformed the U.S. tax code. And in Piketty's book, he blamed Reagan, which everybody on the left loves to hate. It's a badge of honor. And right-thinking people hate Donald Trump, so I think that's okay. We off? I have no objection to that. But now, you know, we've had a dramatic change in the tax code in the United States, which, as an economist, in struggling to find something nice to say about Donald Trump, I think tax reform was going to be very beneficial for the U.S. economy. But I'm sure Piketty doesn't. He disagrees because he's established it. He blames the income tax reform in the United States, in particular, for some of these income disparities. Now this has changed now. In 2012, the top 1% of U.S. households had almost 23% of the income. But by the way, they paid 70% of the taxes, income taxes. I mean, this is one of those other sort of wild declarations. The rich don't pay enough. Well, 70% of the total income revenues are paid by the top 1%. I mean, what do you want them to pay, 100%? I mean, again, in other words, they kept 20% of what they produced, right? Or what they reported. Of course, there's ways to adjust it and all that, but we are in the situation where we've granted to the state the first claim over our income based upon ideology, party politics, or bad economics. Where we are desperately seeking justifications for the state to acquire more power so they can extract more resources. Now, wait a minute. Should the Indian government get one more rupee from anyone if they persist in the waste and corruption and the losses of the crores and crores of rupee that are lost by mismanagement? What is the justification to give any state more of your hard-earned money when they do nothing to change what they know exists? And it is an abomination. These are injustices. This is unfair. This is unreasonable. Don't worry about Jack Ma. If the amount of outrage would be consolidated in India to halt the grotesque waste that you probably observed, whether it's in the government storage of pulses through some agricultural program that spoil because of the infestation with vermin or damp. These are unreal, and there are people starving that could be better served if those foodstuffs were more sensibly maintained or distributed. But it goes on day after day, and you're not outraged by that. You're outraged by the fact that Bill Gates is a billionaire. I don't get it. The state was not invented to waste. The state was not invented to be corrupt. The state was invented to serve humanity, to allow us to discover our human dignity. And if that human dignity is for me to open a private budget school, the state should step aside. The state should say, my God, thank you, because our primary concern is that our young people become educated by any reasonable means. No, the state interferes with that. The state hates competition. Why is the state in the business of interfering with people entering into private transactions to provide education to people on a voluntary, peaceful exchange process? I don't understand it. So that in the end, many students have fewer economic opportunities because they have poorer levels of education than they might have. So, Piketty, like a lot of people who, he sort of imagines wealth as a passive act. Now, like me, he's a professor. Now, maybe unlike me, my family had businesses. Now, people who never opened a business, never raised capital, never hired employees, or tragically had to fire employees. I had to help fire an employee that we caught red-handed stealing. It broke my heart. It broke my heart. But you can't keep someone like that. I mean, it's likely that most owners are like that. Now, if you live in that world, you understand that wealth creation is not a passive act. You're up until after midnight doing your books, worrying over your finances, trying to figure out how to balance the interests of your... And again, toward the end, the accountant told my dad, he said, you know, Mr. Lingle, from the way things are going, it looks like you're in business just to keep your employees in work. And he said, yeah, I guess that's true. And I think, I don't think my father was exceptional in that regard. I think people, especially in small businesses, develop that human relationship with their workers. They're not these evil, distant capitalists that are somehow caricaturized in Copperfield or other popular writings. So wealth is not something that's just out there. It has to be created. And it takes a lot of hard work. Except, I mean, it doesn't look like hard work for her to create this app, but she had to have the insights, she had to have the sort of technical skills and so on. So wealth can be created much more rapidly in much different way than it used to be. So, but in any case, it's not a passive act. So capital earnings occur if it's used productively. So it has to be done. And productively means it satisfies you. It satisfies humans. They voluntarily trade with you. I can't think of many market exchanges that don't involve complete voluntary exchange, except in the case where governments grant monopolies. So, Piketty also, I think, lacks an appreciation for the importance of the entrepreneur. When Deng Xiaoping began the great transformation of modern China, he kicked it off with one sentence: to be rich is glorious. To be rich is glorious. He said, do not envy, do not resent. Praise the people who become rich, because they are making us richer. Deng Xiaoping, whether he read it or not, understood the logic of Adam Smith in that regard. The wealth of nations is based upon the capacity to trade and the productive abilities of its citizens. So, Piketty would disagree. For him, to be rich is abominable. It should be resisted. It should be reduced. It should be in the hands of somebody. Who? Somebody that has political power. But who is that? Who do you trust with that political power? Me? Trump? Trump? Give me a break. Do you want people like that to have political power? The entrepreneur is the engine of economic growth, not government officials. Government officials can interfere with economic growth and wealth creation, but they do not create wealth. Wealth has to be created through private exchange. And if the state's involved, it's not private exchange.
Chris, we need a bit of time for discussion.
Okay. So, as I mentioned, monetary policy has a lot to do with the problem, or what is said to be the problem, of income inequalities. So, I say that he misunderstands because he thinks of wealth as ownership of financial assets. But wealth is really about the productive capacity of a society. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Now let's move on. He depicts capitalist financial, I just repeated that. Now it turns out that wealth tends to be dissipated through inheritance and so on, but also by philanthropy. It turns out that Bill Gates, you may or may not know this, but Bill Gates intends to give away almost all of his wealth. And he's encouraged people around the world that are billionaires to do this. There's a long tradition in history in the United States of the Rockefellers, the Fords, the Carnegies, to give away all. Andrew Carnegie said, the measure of the man, of the rich man, is that he's poor when he dies. In other words, give it away. And he started, in many ways, this sort of tradition in the United States. He built public libraries in these small towns and villages around America, and I think in other countries as well. So philanthropy, so would the world be better off if Bill Gates' wealth was transferred into the hands of some babu or some political party that was in power at that particular moment? Or would the world be better off if Bill Gates decides on where and how he spends his wealth? Is there a guarantee that what the state does with his wealth will be distributed equitably based upon a theory of justice? That there'll be no privileges or special interests? I would rather let them decide, personally. And again, I don't see a strong argument for it to be otherwise. So that a lot of the this increase in wealth is really on paper, and it's driven by just monetary prices, which again is a function of the central bank policy. So it's not that they necessarily have accumulated more things, it's just the things that they have are more valuable. So if you own a large building on Manhattan, you don't need to buy more of them. It's just that that one will be worth 10 times more than it was when you purchased it. So again, he's overlooking a lot of these very simple explanations. He offers an unsupported belief. He just says that, look, we give the money to the state and they're going to do the right thing with it. Who believes that? Now, in economics, we have this school of public choice economics, which evaluates and interprets the way politics work, sometimes called the economics of democracy. And there's lots of reasons to expect that government officials will not act with probity, prudence, to be long-sighted, to be cautious, to be fair, to be just. Party politics, ideology come into play. In having an international agreement on this, well, it's not going to fly. So that was a waste of breath for him. Look at the Kyoto Protocol, things like that, where people are invested in, deeply invested in an idea, and it still doesn't work. Wealth taxes, well, a wealth tax encourages consumption. But in fact, what drives economies are investment. If you know that someone's going to tax your wealth, you'll consume it. And you'll be less likely to save it. Well, market economies depend upon saving and investment to grow. And so this idea of taxing wealth